This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Ireland, an island of contrasting beauty. Here, on the very fringe of Europe, the rugged Atlantic coastline gives way to a land of greenery, fertility and life. This is a place with an identity all of its own, both physically and culturally, a land of mist and magic that delights visitors from all over the world. Ireland is a land with an ancient past, an ancient Celtic past. It was 1,500 years ago that St. Patrick arrived here, bringing the word of Christ to a people already centuries old. St. Patrick's mission was ultimately successful, and his status is secure as one of the greatest figures of Irish legend. But the arrival of Christianity did not eliminate altogether the old ways of life in Ireland. The Celtic tradition lived on. By reading the surviving sagas of Irish Celtic literature, we can see that St. Patrick is just one of the legendary figures of old Ireland. The stories of great heroes such as Cuchulainn and McCool are still told today, keeping alive the Celtic tradition of the bard. These wonderful stories may be largely mythical, but there are also tales of undeniably real Celtic heroes. The struggles of Vercingetorix and Queen Boudicca also express fully the spirit of a remarkable people. It was a spirit that not even St. Patrick could quench. The man who would become patron saint of Ireland was born around 389 AD, probably in the southwest of England. We know that his family had connections with the early Christian church, although Patrick's own account of his boyhood reveals an early lack of interest in the Christian faith and a typically boyish neglect for his studies. But when he was a youth of about 14, he was taken from his home by a gang of Irish raiders who enslaved him on the island. According to legend, Patrick spent his early days in Ireland looking after his captors' livestock. It was here in the cold, dark and empty nights, watching over the cattle, that he is said to have learned to turn to God for help and comfort. In so doing, the young man became committed to his faith. During his time on the land, Patrick began to experience visions, urging him to escape from his captivity. After a period of some 6 years, he succeeded. He fled his master's farm, made his way to the coast, and departed the island of Ireland by sea. He travelled to what is now northern France, where, after calling on God for his help, he returned to the land of his upbringing. But he simply could not settle down. He felt a strange compulsion to return to the land where he had been held captive, Ireland. In preparation, he returned to France, where he received his formal training as a priest before journeying back to the Irish island. Initially, his role was that of assistant to a missionary of more senior status. But when his fellow Christian died on the road, Patrick was ordained and charged with carrying the mission alone. Landing in Strangford Lough, he established his first church in a barn given to him by the local lord, and he began to convert the local population to Christianity. It would be a difficult task, since the Irish people already possessed a deep and ancient culture with a strong spiritual element. They were Celts, a people with their own holy men, the Druids.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Enjoy our rich library of documentaries covering key events and locations of the medieval period. History Hit's medieval offering features leading historians such as Dan Jones, Eleanor Janega and Kat Jarman. Not only that, but we've a rich library of audio documentaries covering every period of history through our network of podcasts. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
The Druids, of course, were enormously important to the Celts, and their fame has come down through history. It's surprising, therefore, that we don't know a great deal about them. What we can gather about the Druids is that they were the repository of the law in both senses, law as in legal system and law as in the culture of the Celtic people. We do know that the Druids conducted religious ceremonies, and from what we can gather, these appeared to take place in the famous oak groves. We do know that the Druids, or part of the Druidic religion, centred around trees, and we still have vestiges of the Druidic tree alphabet, which to some extent is still associated with the Gaelic and the Gaelic alphabet.
Patrick's mission would bring him into direct conflict with the Druids and their followers. Confronted by the Christian, the Druids ordered a contest of faith, a trial of powers between Patrick and the Druid magician Lochit Moe. It was Patrick who prevailed, and Christianity began to establish itself in Ireland. But still, the crusading priest met resistance, and matters came to a head on Easter Day in 433 AD. The Christian festival coincided with the Druid Spring Festival. At this time, at the instructions of the Druids, all the fires in the land were extinguished, to be relit from the one fire burning on the hill of Tara, which was the royal residence and a profoundly sacred place. This ancient ritual symbolized the coming of spring and the rebirth of the land. Patrick chose to effect a confrontation by lighting his own Easter fire nearby.
So when the High King saw this fire, he was absolutely furious and sent his officers to arrest this man. But his Druid said to him, "Your Majesty, if we do not put out the fire of this new religion today, it will burn forever after in this land." Well, that's what happened. And Patrick escaped because he quoted psalms such as "Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we will trust in God." And there was a thunderstorm, and the king's horses panicked and fled. And the king had other officers at the foot of the mountain to arrest him, but all they saw was a herd of deer, and so the tradition grew that the prayer called Patrick's breastplate is the cry of the deer.
Other well-known legends about Patrick are that he banished all the serpents, representing evil, from the island of Ireland. He is also said to have used the three-leaved shamrock as a way to explain the Trinity, the concept of Father, Son and Holy Ghost being one. To this day, the shamrock remains the emblem of St. Patrick and the national flower of the Irish people. Significantly, Patrick is also credited with bringing to Ireland the gift of writing. We know that Irish literacy did begin around the time of Patrick's ministry, helping to further spread the word of Christ. But the arrival of the written word achieved something else for Ireland. It helped preserve the folklore of the existing native tradition. Thanks to the efforts of modern archaeologists, we now know the origin of that tradition. It stems not from Ireland, but from Central Europe. discoveries of ancient artifacts at locations such as Hallstatt in Austria have revealed the earliest secrets of the people who continued to flourish in St. Patrick's Island over 1,000 years later, the Celts. The people of Hallstatt flourished around 700 BC, a time when Europe was undergoing a technological revolution. Across the continent, iron began to replace bronze as the principal material for weapons and edged tools. The iron-using innovators of Hallstatt mark the beginning of Celtic culture, and these mysterious craftsmen are the first of the Celtic peoples.
There is some mystery about the origins of the Celts, but scholars nowadays tend to think that they originated somewhere in the region of the Indian subcontinent, and by a series of migrations moved across Europe, through Spain, up into northern Europe, and also by a more northerly route through Switzerland and into northern Europe that way.
The Celts are often portrayed as wild barbarians, the antithesis of civilized people. The problem we have here is that one of our major sources for studying the Celts is from the point of view of the Greek and Roman world, looking outwards at these so-called barbarians. This is a particular problem with one of our main sources, which is of course Julius Caesar's own narrative of the Gallic Wars. It's the Greeks and the Romans who give us such words as barbarian and civilized, and it's arranged according to their cultural preoccupations and preconceptions. We do have a corrective to this, which is from looking at the evidence left by the Celts themselves, from the excavation of their settlements, their houses, their burials, and from the objects in them. And it's quite clear from this that the Celts, by the time of Caesar, were an organized, sophisticated society with a very considerable technological ability and able to produce what to our eyes appear extremely beautiful objects.
In the centuries that followed, the Hallstatt people spread throughout Europe, settling an area from the southeast coast of Britain eastward towards Austria and Switzerland, and south into the Iberian Peninsula. Around 500 BC, a more dynamic phase of development began. This period saw renewed expansion as the Celts began a series of conquests which consolidated their hold on Europe. Celtic tribes from Switzerland and southern Germany invaded Macedonia and Greece, eventually settling in parts of the Balkans and Asia Minor. In Britain, they moved north and west from their initial settlements into Yorkshire and parts of Scotland. And it was only a matter of time before the Celts arrived on the island of Ireland. Celtic tribes also moved south into Italy, famously attacking Rome itself. In the year 390 BC, an army of Celtic warriors carved a Roman citizen army into bloody ruin, forcing their way into what was already a great city. Driven into their high citadel, the Roman citizens could only watch in despair as their proud home was laid to waste. Faced with starvation, they agreed to pay a huge ransom in gold to their triumphant enemy. In simple terms, the Romans were forced to pay the Celts to go away. Their defeat had been total, but there was more humiliation to come. As the gold was being weighed, the Celtic leader Brennus stepped forward and, in a dramatic gesture, flung his sword onto the scales with the words, "Vae victis," woe to the defeated. He wanted even more gold. Left with no other alternative, the Romans had to hand over the last gold in the city. It was a bitter humiliation which Rome would never forget. In time, they would have a terrible revenge. The Romans called the invaders the Gauls. The mists of time and the passing of the centuries have obliterated much of their history. But in the 4th century BC, we know that they dominated a vast swathe of land, stretching from the Atlantic to the Black Sea and from the Baltic to the warm shores of the Mediterranean. Although classical writers were quick to dismiss them as savage barbarians, the Gauls enjoyed a rich and diverse culture and a clearly structured society. Celtic social organisation was based on the tribe, each of which had its own distinctive name. Tribal identity was intimately connected with territorial integrity, and the Celtic tribes were jealous of their borders, which defined a patchwork of petty kingdoms. This persisted in many Celtic areas into relatively modern times. The clan system in Scotland is a continuing legacy of this tribal system. Within the tribe, Celtic society was a rigidly hierarchical caste system. Among the free Celts, it was essentially threefold: kings, nobles, and free commoners. But like many ancient peoples, the Celts also had an underclass condemned to a life of poverty and even slavery. The tribal leaders were kings, although the Druids were generally afforded higher status. Each king was elected by the tribal aristocracy from the kin of his predecessor, although he was not necessarily one of his sons. Among later Romanized tribes, the institution of kingship was replaced by that of chief magistrate. Such magistrates ruled in conjunction with the nobles, who were often haughty and aristocratic, and tended to be somewhat aloof from the ordinary people. It was from this class of people that the legendary Celtic warriors were drawn. The warriors were in many ways the embodiment of Celtic society. Privileged and spoiled, their sole purpose in life was fighting. All Celtic social organisation was geared to supporting this objective. Warfare formed an essential part of Celtic everyday life, and the warriors were its personification.
The Celts were really famous for their spectacular courage and bravado. They mounted successful campaigns, sacked Rome, even assaulted Delphi, but they never established an empire in the classic sense because they were more interested in the pursuit of war rather than the pursuit of empire. This lack of organisation was reflected in the way in which they actually waged war. To the Celts, war was something of a cult, and that cult was one of the individual. Julius Caesar, amongst others, mentions the Celts as being particularly ferocious in battle. But he also points out that they lack forward planning and organisation. Therefore, in order to defeat the Celts, all that another army needs to do is to outwit them and make them angry, because then they will charge straight at you. And eventually, if they've got enough loot on a campaign, they will go home. This has certain parallels throughout the whole of Celtic history. In particular, the campaigns mounted with the Highlanders by Montrose during the English Civil War, and also for the Scottish armies during the Jacobite rebellions.
Fighting, especially single combat, man-to-man, was regarded as the right and proper way of life for young heroes. As we shall see, this warrior spirit lies at the heart of the greatest stories of Irish legend, stories that are still told today. Sadly, the military muscle of the Celtic tribes would prove inadequate against a truly organised enemy. An enemy such as Julius Caesar's Rome. By the 1st century BC, the Celts were in retreat. Pressure from Rome and the German tribes of the east left only the British Isles and the territory of Gaul as free Celtic lands. These Gallic Celts would ultimately fall to Caesar's legions, but only after an epic struggle in which the Celts succeeded in organising themselves into a huge single force. They were led by a man whose deeds show that the themes of the Irish legends are rooted in hard historical fact. His name was Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was a young man in 52 BC, possibly as young as 20. But that year, he displayed military leadership far beyond his years. He was a member of the Arvernian tribe, but he knew that the Gallic Celts would have to be united to stand a chance against the Roman troops then conquering Gaul. Under his leadership, an enormous army was formed, with tribes from all over Gaul contributing fighting men. But the rebellion started inauspiciously. At Avaricum, the centre of the Boudicca tribe, Caesar's legions were triumphant. According to the Roman leader himself, some 40,000 inhabitants were killed. Camped nearby, Vercingetorix knew that the loss of Avaricum was a real blow, but that it did not mean the end of the uprising. In fact, it was about to gather momentum. Caesar now decided to attack Gergovia, capital of Vercingetorix's own tribe, the Arverni. He deployed 6 of his 10 Gallic legions. But when he arrived, he found that the Celts had positioned themselves extremely well. Their stronghold was a high plateau, whose southern edge was defined by a huge defensive wall. On the slope below, Vercingetorix placed a detachment of troops, themselves protected by a smaller wall. As a first move, Caesar decided to attack this position, and 3 legions quickly secured this aim. But in the heat of the battle, the Roman troops charged up the hill towards the main stronghold. Seeing what was occurring, Vercingetorix dispatched forces to attack from the flanks, and after fierce fighting, the Romans were forced to call off the attack. Gergovia proved that the Romans could be beaten, and Vercingetorix was now a hero, a status he never lost. Gallic tribes who had so far stayed neutral now joined with him. The important Aedui tribe, who had previously supported the Romans, now joined the rebels. Caesar's response was to take his legions north to join with the rest of his army, before heading back south towards Provincia. But as the Roman troops made their journey, the leader of their opponents made the first of 2 decisions that would prove disastrous. Vercingetorix decided to ambush the legions using 3 detachments of cavalry. He did not use his infantry, and Caesar was able to see off the attack with a massive loss of rebel lives. We will never know for sure why Vercingetorix made this decision, or whether the Romans would have been defeated had foot soldiers been deployed. What we do know is that the Celtic leader's response would also prove to be a mistake. He decided to retreat to the plateau stronghold of Alesia, taking 80,000 of his best troops, while his cavalry set off to raise an army from the whole of Gaul. But Caesar now proved his mastery of siege warfare. Around Alesia, his men constructed an enormous siege works, whose pits, towers and ramparts prevented Vercingetorix and his men from breaking out. They also prevented his allies from breaking in. As the besieged Celts began to run out of supplies, their fellow rebels arrived in the form of a stupendous army, possibly 250,000 strong. By contrast, the Roman force contained just 50,000. But their siege works proved decisive. After a number of bloody attempts to break through the defences and relieve their leader, the Celtic army gave up the fight and broke up. Shortly afterwards, Vercingetorix surrendered. Though the Gallic rebellion was ultimately defeated, The achievement of Vercingetorix should not be dismissed lightly. Though the Celtic tribes were autonomous and lacked any central administration, he succeeded in putting together an army which may have been the biggest ever seen in Europe at the time. Caesar himself praised a worthy adversary. But superior Roman organization and Caesar's skill ultimately won through. Vercingetorix himself was eventually taken to Rome and forced to take part in a triumphal procession in Caesar's honor. Afterwards, he was ritually strangled. But over 2,000 years later, he remains a potent symbol of rebellion, and he is now accepted as the first great national figure of France. Across the Channel in Britain, that status is also enjoyed by a Celtic individual who led fierce resistance to the Romans. Not a man, but one of the most famous women of all history, Boudicca. Or, to use the title she enjoyed in life, Queen Boudicca of the Iceni. By AD 60, much of Britain was under Roman control or influence, but still the native Celts resisted the power of the legions. That year, the Roman governor, Suetonius, found himself campaigning against the Druids in their power base off North Wales. But while he was engaged there, elsewhere in Britain, one of his colleagues made a foolish mistake that would threaten the Roman occupation itself. In the present-day region of East Anglia, there lived the Iceni tribe, a client state ruled by King Psasategus. When he died, he named his wife Boudicca and his daughters as the joint heirs to half his kingdom. The other half he offered to Rome, hoping that this would at least maintain some independence for his tribe. But his hope was in vain. Rome chose instead to formally conquer the Iceni territory, and their sheer brutality provoked outrage amongst the natives. Iceni settlements were looted and destroyed, with many of their inhabitants carried off to slavery. The Iceni rulers were not spared. In a fatal miscalculation, the daughters of the Iceni queen were raped, and Boudicca herself was scourged. It was this, more than anything, that sparked the Iceni into rebellion, a rebellion led by the queen herself. Over the course of the following months, Boudicca proved herself the equal of Vercingetorix. Like her fellow Celt 100 years before, she gathered together an army. She persuaded a neighboring tribe, the Trinovantes, to join with the Iceni. Soon, she was in a position to lead a huge force of Celtic warriors on an offensive campaign. Their first target was Cuchulainn, a lightly defended Roman colony populated by veteran soldiers. The site of present-day Colchester, Cuchulainn, had a strong symbolic value, since this was where the Romans had built a great temple to Emperor Claudius, a construction despised by the natives. Under Boudicca's leadership, the colony was attacked, and in just 2 days, it was taken. Fired by an understandable hatred, the Celtic warriors exacted a terrible and bloody revenge. Appropriately, it was the hated temple of Claudius that witnessed the last stand of the Roman defenders, but there was nothing they could do. After an orgy of slaughter, Boudicca emerged triumphant. Far away in Wales, Suetonius was informed of the grim news from Cuchulainn. At once, he set off to take charge of the situation. He travelled to the new Roman port of Londinium, but realized that it could not be defended if, as seemed likely, it was attacked. He ordered the city abandoned. Sure enough, Boudicca's army arrived shortly afterwards, slaughtering any who had stayed behind. Meanwhile, Suetonius was organizing his British legions in preparation for a full-scale engagement with the rebel forces. Significantly, he was prepared to wait for the opportunity to give battle at a location of his own choosing. But still, the rebellion gathered speed. Fired by the successes of Camulodunum and Londinium, more and more natives flocked to Boudicca's cause. Her forces now headed northwest along the Roman Watling Street and took Verulamium, present-day St. Albans, in another bloody conquest. The Roman occupation was now in real danger. If the Britons could defeat Suetonius and his legions, the Romans might be expelled from Britain for good. The decisive battle was not long in coming. At a still undetermined site in the English Midlands, the two armies finally faced each other. As was the case in Roman times, the leaders of the opposing forces sought to inspire their troops before the battle. Suetonius' speech was dismissive of his foe, while Queen Boudicca chose to motivate her troops by reminding them of the outrage that had sparked the rebellion in the first place. The formalities over, the battle began. The numerically superior British forces charged the Roman positions, but it was Roman tactics, not strength of manpower, that proved decisive. Acting on the express instructions of their commander, the Roman troops maintained their position until the time came to throw their javelins with deadly effect. As waves of rebel troops drove forward, the Romans advanced in a wedge formation, and the British found themselves hampered in the narrow strip of land that formed the battle site. As Boudicca watched in horror, her troops were soon in flight. The bloodshed was appalling. It is possible that as many as 150,000 perished. What is certain is that Boudicca's great rebellion was finally over. Knowing her likely fate if she were captured, she decided to take poison. Her death marked the end of large-scale British resistance to the Romans, but it also signaled the beginning of her legend. She is the first great figure in the history of Britain, a heroine who was, undeniably, a Celt. The decades that followed Boudicca's death saw Britain become a thoroughly Romanized province, like Gaul before it. But the Romans would never conquer the whole of the British Isles. The Celtic way of life lived on in the Highlands of Scotland and in Ireland. Here, the old traditions were maintained, including the age-old Celtic love of storytelling. In Ireland, these tales evolved into a substantial body of poetic literature. And when the arrival of St. Patrick and Christianity brought literacy to Ireland, these tales could at last be written down and preserved. This is the origin of the great stories of Irish legend which we know today. Undoubtedly, and unsurprisingly, the most famous of these stories concern two great warriors, Finn McCool and Cuchulainn. Although Cuchulainn is likely to have actually existed as a historical figure sometime during the 1st century AD, the stories that we now know of his life belong more to the realm of myth than that of fact. But their value is not as a document of history. Instead, they remain great achievements of literature that reveal the concerns of the people who created them. The story of how Cuchulainn acquired his name is a popular and typical example of the genre.
King Conor of Ulster had a sister named Dectira. Dectira's husband was named Sualtam. Sualtam was a border guard. He was a member of the Red Branch Knights that were around King Conor, the King of Ulster. His border post was at Dundalk, It's called Dún Dalgan, which means the fort of Dalgan, and the fort is just outside the modern County Louth town of Dundalk. At the moment, as I'm speaking, we are in the County Museum in Dundalk. Dectera had a son named Sheitanta. Her husband was not the father of the son. Sheitanta's father was Lu, the sun god of the two-headed Annan. Sultum more or less drops out of the story early on. Sheitanta and his mother Dectera lived at Dundalgan, the border post. What you see now at Dundalgan is the remains of an 18th century house on top of a 12th century Anglo-Norman motte, that is an earthen defensive mound, which is probably on top of an earlier Celtic defensive position, which is on the high point of a ridge overlooking the Castletown River. Sheitanta and Dectera were living there. When Sheitanta was about 5 years old, some Red Branch Knights came along the road on their way north to Armagh, the Ulster capital. Sheitanta said to his mother, "Who are those men?" She said, "Those are Red Branch Knights." Sheitanta said, "I want to be a Red Branch Knight." His mother said, "Yes, dear, when you grow up." "No," he said, "I want to be a Red Branch Knight now." "Which way is Armagh?" She said, "The way those knights are going, just up to the north." He said, "Okay, I'm off to be a Red Branch Knight. Bye, Mom." And off he went to Armagh. When he arrived at Armagh at the King's Palace, on the green outside the King's Palace, the boy troop were playing hurling. These were the boys who were in training to be warriors up to the age of about 17. And Sheitanta said, "Well, I know how to do that. This is a good way to meet the boys." So he ran in among them with his hurley, took the slither, the ball, away from them, knocked them all down, and scored a goal. Well, there were bloody noses and black eyes and broken heads and broken bones and howls and wails all over the playing field. The arms master, Fergus, came out and said, "What's all the commotion about?" And they said, "He took the slither away from us and he came in among us and scored a goal." And Fergus says, "What's your name, little fella?" And he says, "Well, my name is Sheitanta, my mother is Dectera." And Fergus says, "Well then, you are Conor's nephew. Come in and meet your Uncle Conor." So King Conor took Sheitanta under his arm and took care of him, looked after him, made sure that he got arms and everything. One day, when Conor and the Red Branch Knights were off to a feast at Cullen's house, not too far away, Conor stopped by the playing field and said to Sheitanta, "Would you like to come along to the feast with us?" And Sheitanta said, "Well, I'm busy playing with the boys now. You go ahead and I'll follow your chariot tracks." So he went ahead to Cullen's house. They went into the house. They were feasting and drinking, and perhaps a bit more of the drinking than the feasting. When it got dark, Cullen said to Conor, "Are all of your people here, or are you expecting anybody else?" And Conor, forgetting about Sheitanta, said, "No, we're all here. Why do you ask?" Cullen said, "Because I have a ferocious guard dog, and anyone who comes here after dark, he will kill immediately." And Conor said, "No, we're all here. Let your guard dog out." Well, little Sheitanta came along, having finished his game with the boys, came up to Cullen's house. The guard dog saw Sheitanta, Sheitanta saw the guard dog. Now Sheitanta was busy throwing his slither up into the air, throwing the hurley and throwing his javelin up after them and catching all three before they fell. He saw the guard dog making for him. He threw the slither up into the air, hit it with the hurley, knocked it into the dog's mouth, down his throat, all the way through the dog, out the back, and killed the dog. Conor and Cullen and the Red Branch Knights came down. They ran out. They were very relieved that Sheitanta was all right, but Cullen was lamenting about the death of his guard dog. He said, "It took me a year to train and raise that dog until he's the best guard dog in all of Ireland. What am I going to do for a guard dog until I can raise and train another one?" And Sheitanta said, "Well, since I'm the one who killed your guard dog, I will be your guard dog. I will be the Hound of Cullen," which is Cuchulainn in Irish. And that's how Cuchulainn got his name.
The stories of Cuchulainn form part of the Ulster cycle of Irish literature, a collection of over 100 stories full of great warriors and heroes. Cuchulainn himself is the greatest of these colourful figures, a man prepared to make any sacrifice for the honour of his people, as we find out in the poignant story of Cuchulainn and his only son.
We're in the County Museum in Dundalk in County Louth. This is a representation of a cross-section of a bog. The bogs preserve things for archaeologists. We have a stone axe for the Neolithic. This looks to me to be about early or to mid-Iron Age. This is a bog road. This seems to be a medieval slipper or moccasin, medieval, late medieval, on up to our beloved 20th century and the plastic milk cartons. The time of the cattle raid of Cooley, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, is set just about the time of Christ, so right around this time in the bog. The Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid, and the stories of Cuchulainn are part of the Ulster cycle, and these stories are stories about kings and warriors. Not surprisingly, they're quite bloody and very often tragic. And to me, one of the saddest stories, because, in my opinion, something terrible happens for not a very good reason, and perhaps this is the essence of tragedy. One of the most tragic stories is the story of the death of Conla. Conla was Cuchulainn's only son, but in the manuscripts it's called the death of Aoife's only son, and this is how it happened. Cuchulainn was sent away to graduate warrior school on the Isle of Skye. This was a school of Scáthach, a female warrior. Another female warrior named Aoife attacked Scáthach while Cuchulainn was Scáthach's student. And Cuchulainn was defending Scáthach. He was in hand-to-hand combat with Aoife, and Aoife got him down on his back, and she was about to kill him. And Cuchulainn knew her weak point. He says, "Look, look, look, there are Aoife's horses and her chariot. They're going over the cliff." And Aoife turned around to look, and Cuchulainn took advantage and got her on her back. And he held his sword up to her throat and said, "Now, you will stay with me for a year, you will bear me a son, or I'll kill you." She agreed. And so she was pregnant by Cuchulainn when Cuchulainn left to come back to Ireland. Cuchulainn did a very strange thing, something that works out very well according to the story, but it seems to me a little bit silly. First of all, he gave Aoife a gold ring, and he said, when the boy, if it's a son, is old enough to fit this ring, send him to Ireland to find me. And he put geish on his son. Geish is a prohibition in this case. He said, this is geish for him. It is geish, it is taboo, it's prohibited for him to give his name to any single warrior. It's also forbidden for him to refuse a fight. And with that, off he went back home. And he married Emer. According to some stories, Aoife heard about this and was very jealous and decided to put her own geish, and this is where the geish came from, on Conla. But according to the original story, it was Cuchulainn's geish. One time, King Conor and the Red Branch Knights were standing around on the strand here at Dundalk, and they saw a boat come across the sea to them. In this boat was a young boy, about 10 years old, and he had a neat little trick. He could throw his sling up into the air and trap birds and bring them down without killing them. Now, this is something that Cuchulainn himself used to do when he was a boy. The boy came up to the shore. Conor said, well, he's a stranger. He sent one of his warriors down to find out what the boy's name was. The boy, of course, could not give his name to a single warrior. He said, I won't tell you my name. The boy said, well, you tell me or you'll fight me. The boy said, okay, I'll fight you. And so the warrior drew his sword. Conla took a sling, put a stone in the sling, and bang in the middle of the forehead on the warrior. The warrior was down. He said, well, I don't like to fight children anyway. He went back up to King Conor. Conor sent Conall Cernach, the great Ulster hero, down. Same thing happened to Conall Cernach. He went back to Conor. The only thing to do was to send for Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn was sent for, the champion of the king, the champion of Ulster. It's very likely, and in William Butler Yeats's version of this story in his play, he says very definitely Cuchulainn recognized something in the boy's eyes. He recognized his friend Aoife, the boy's mother, in the boy's eyes, and he suspected this was his son. But Cuchulainn had no choice. He was the champion of Ulster. The boy refused to give his name, and he had to challenge him. The boy, because of his geish, could not reveal his name. Cuchulainn and Conla fought, and according to one story, Conla pushed Cuchulainn down under the waves, and Cuchulainn nearly drowned. And the weight of pushing him down indented either the boys' or Cuchulainn's feet into a stone, which some say years ago could have been seen on the beach at Dundalk. But because Cuchulainn was almost beaten by his own son, Cuchulainn had to save himself. He got out his trusty Boudicca, the magic spear that had the prongs, the barbed prongs inside, and he killed his own son with the Boudicca. In Yeats's play, it's very touching at the end. He picks up the boy's body, delivers the body to King Conor and to the Red Branch Knights, and he says, "Men of Ulster, this is what I have done for you. I have killed my only son for you."
Cuchulainn's love of his people is also revealed in the most famous of the stories of the Ulster cycle, the cattle raid of Cooley. Here again we have a tale of great heroism and adventure, with Cuchulainn compelled once more to fight for Ulster. In this case, his enemy is from the land of Connacht, an enemy keen to take one of the greatest prizes in the whole of Ulster, the brown bull of Cooley. But this enemy is not a man. In the Celtic tradition of the powerful female warrior, Cuchulainn must do battle with the Queen of Connacht, Queen Maeve.
We're on the top of Dundalgan, which is an earthen defensive mound which was built in the 12th century by the Anglo-Normans, probably on top of an earlier Celtic defensive site. Dundalgan means the fort of Delaga. Delaga was a king who lived about 4,000 years ago. Locally, this mound, or motte, is called Cuchulainn's Castle, or Cuchulainn's Mount, because by local tradition, Cuchulainn lived here as a child. Behind me you can see the Carlingford Peninsula, the Carlingford Mountains. The old name of that is the Cooley Hills, and this is where the brown bull of Cooley was kept, in the small kingdom of Cooley.
The Toynbee Cooley, the story of the brown bull of Cooley, is a fantastically long and involved saga. It's a story that begins with a king and queen in bed, the king and queen of Connacht lying in bed, and they get into a little competition match with each other where each says, "I'm of a higher status than you. Aren't you lucky you married such a beautiful woman as me who's so rich?" And he says, "Well, you should be lucky that you married such a handsome and rich man as me." And this little bedtime competition escalates, and they begin to name their wealth. And the queen, who's Maeve, and the king, who's Ailill, get to the point where they realize they're of the same level of wealth. And then Ailill says, and I have a fantastic bull. Fantastic, you know, as they only are in sagas. And she is stumped, because they're equal up to this point, but he has this bull, and she has no equivalent. And what this means for her is that in Irish law, her husband, because he's the wealthier of the two, can dominate her in the marriage. Whereas if she was a woman of equal wealth, then she would be of equal status within the marriage. And Maeve is not a woman who wants to be dominated by her husband. Maeve was born to dominate. So she is determined that she is going to get a bull that exceeds that of her husband so that she can dominate him in their marriage. And she's heard tell of one in Ulster, and she's going to go get it. And it is the brown bull of Cooley. And the whole of the saga unfolds from that moment. She is determined that she is going to get this brown bull of Cooley in Ulster. And the saga unrolls from that. And the saga of the Toynbee Cooley is all the adventures that happen on the way, all of the adventures of the people of Ulster trying to defend their brown bull and themselves against the host of warriors brought by Maeve to get this bull, and all of the side stories, you know, all the subplots and digressions from it. In the end, of course, it all ends rather badly anyway. The bull ends up dying, but nevertheless, a good time has been had by all along the way.
There are a number of recurring themes in the stories that make up the Ulster cycle. The concept of the individual champion of the tribe is one. The importance of an individual's honour is also repeatedly emphasised, as well as the ongoing need to fight for it. In these Celtic stories, as in Celtic life, it is the skills of warfare that provide the means for social advancement. even the closest of friends could be compelled to meet in battle, as Cuchulainn himself finds out in one of the saddest of all the Ulster Cycle tales.
This is the river that flows through the village of Ardee in County Louth. The Irish for Ardee is Baile á Irdia. This means the town of the ford of Ferdia, and that's its main claim to fame. Now, I'll back up a little bit in the story of the cattle raid of Cooley. Cuchulainn wanted to marry Emer. Emer's father said, no, unless you go to graduate school for warriors first. He put this as a condition on Cuchulainn because he suspected that Cuchulainn would not survive Scotland's graduate school on the Isle of Skye. He hoped he wouldn't survive. Cuchulainn survived, and there are other stories on that, but this is where he met Ferdia. Ferdia became his blood brother, his closer than brother friend. Unfortunately, Ferdia was a Firbog from Connacht, and at the time of the Táin, the cattle raid of Cooley, he was fighting on the side of Maeve in the invasion against Ulster. Cuchulainn was the champion of Ulster, defending Ulster against the invasion. Cuchulainn and Ferdia didn't want to fight each other, and they refused to fight each other. Queen Maeve was offering her daughter money, fame, everything to Ferdia, and he refused to fight Cuchulainn because they were best friends. Finally, Maeve found his weak point. She challenged his courage. She said, I think you're afraid to fight Cuchulainn. You're afraid he's going to kill you. That got him. He finally agreed to fight Cuchulainn, and by local tradition, the fight was right here at the ford in Ardee. And there's a standing stone that's been here for a long time to commemorate that event. Now, what happened in the battle? The first day, Cuchulainn and Ferdia hacked and sawed at each other with their weapons. Neither got the better of the other. At the end of the day, they bound up each other's wounds. They gave each other food and helped each other. Second day, they hacked at each other again, and Cuchulainn was afraid he was not going to be able to beat Ferdia. So he told his charioteer, if tomorrow it looks as if I'm losing, I want you to send me the Guy Boudicca on the water. Now, the Guy Boudicca is a mysterious weapon. It apparently is loaded with springs and barbs. It enters the bullock, the stomach, and when it goes into the stomach, the springs send the barbs through the person's body. And there is no way to extract this weapon without killing the person. So if you're hit by the Guy Boudicca, you're dead. This Guy Boudicca was given to Cuchulainn by Scotland, and he was the only one, as far as we know, who ever used it. On the third day, Cuchulainn got a very severe wound from Ferdia. Ferdia was about to defeat him, and Cuchulainn called for the Guy Boudicca. His charioteer sent it across the water. Cuchulainn took it with his toes and got under Ferdia's defenses and put it into his belly, and he killed his best friend. And then he lamented while the army of the rest of Ireland came toward him, and he was urged by his charioteer to get away. They're going to come and they're going to kill you. But Cuchulainn went on for pages and pages in the manuscript, lamenting that he had killed his best friend, his blood brother, Ferdia.
The second of the great cycles of Irish legend is also dominated by the exploits of one amazing warrior, a man who, in modern terms, could be described as a superhero. This is the Fenian cycle, and their central figure is Finn McCool. Like Cuchulainn, Finn McCool was almost certainly a real historical figure who lived around the 2nd century AD. Finn is also a great warrior, but he is also a poet, the leader of a group of men whose skills with weapons are matched by their skills with words. Perhaps because of this, many students feel that the adventures of Finn represent the greatest stories of Irish legend.
Somebody said once that Fionn McCool is everybody, that Fionn McCool is the person. All the intricate and difficult feelings and experiences that we have as individuals are Fionn McCool. Fionn is the most generous man who ever lived, but also in some stories he's quite a mean and stingy man. Fionn is the most noble and brave man who ever lived, but in some stories he acts out the part of a coward. Fionn is the most well-intentioned man who ever lived, yet in some stories he's very vindictive and jealous. So that Fionn is really what we are ourselves. And for 1,500 years, Irish people and Scottish people and Manx people have been imagining the stories of Fionn McCool and have been entertained by them because Fionn is so human and he's so multifaceted also.
The richness and diversity of Finn McCool's character contribute vitally to the impact of the stories which concern him. In one of the best-known tales, he is furious to find out that his fellow warrior, Dermid, has run off with Groenia, the king's daughter and object of his own affections. An epic story unfolds as Finn hunts down his fellow Fenian, only for the two men to be eventually reconciled. Throughout the cycle, Finn's pursuit of wisdom is also emphasized. It is this balance of the active and the reflective that give the stories of Finn their continuing appeal.
The legend of Fionn McCool includes Fionn taking lots of risks to gain wisdom. He's the man who, as a boy, put his thumb in the cauldron of wisdom and gained wisdom. And I think there's something very eternal about that quest for wisdom. Fionn is a hero who's not only a military hero, but he's almost a spiritual hero. You know, he undergoes transformations, he undertakes quests, and he has insight and wisdom in addition to the ability just to fight. And I think as a hero, he's more three-dimensional than Cuchulainn. He's more three-dimensional than a lot of heroes. And I think for anybody who's a reader of stories, who has an aspiration for insight and knowledge and poetry, then Fionn is a natural hero. And the Irish culture has always been one which values learning and poetry and insight and wisdom. And so Fionn is an eternal hero for that, I think.
The stories of Irish legend are one of the most vibrant and enduring legacies of the ancient people who created them. When St. Patrick arrived in Ireland, it was this island, and this island alone, that fully retained a Celtic identity, the same identity that inspired Vercingetorix and Boudicca, the identity that provides the setting for the stories of Cuchulainn and Finn, the Irish legends. There is no reason to suppose that future generations will not find them as fascinating and inspirational as those who have already come to appreciate them across the centuries of time.